So my first manuscript is called Train of Thought, and it's all about what happens when an artist gets a day job and rides into work. All of the poems were written on the train, so it was the, thoughts of the Train of Thought commuter.
Welcome to the First Coast.fm podcast, a creative platform of expression for musicians, artists, filmmakers, and the unsung heroes who behind the scenes help to make the First Coast of Florida a community rich in culture and a melting pot of ideas. I'm your host, Fernando Bernal.
A flood of art, a flood of love, a flood of peace. Saint Augustine, Florida, do you realize how amazing you are?
Our conversation today is with author and poet Chris Bodor, whose poetry has been translated into multiple languages and is the inspiration of young poets and a driving force of the poetry scene here in Saint Augustine, the ancient city. Let's get started. All right.
Hey ho.
Chris, welcome. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Me too. I've been following you for a while and seeing some of your poems and your contribution to the community, and I was just interested in having you here.
Yeah.
So you're a poet.
I am. And you know what defines a person as a poet? Someone who writes poetry.
Okay.
So
just the writing of it is sufficient. You don't have to recite it. Just
because I thought it had some more lofty definition, and someone, it's inevitable. You scribble these confessional things into notebooks, you type them up with nimble fingers, send them to publishers and get published, and then people find out about your written words, and they start calling you a poet. And so it was a transformation process where I would shrug it off, no, I just wrote up some poems, and then someone said, Chris, you are a poet because you write poems. And so, that was my introduction into this new title that is affixed to me.
How long you been doing this?
Oh my goodness! I bypassed the high school route. I did have some interesting English classes where we analyzed the lyrics of Jim Morrison, of Simon and Garfunkel, Bruce Springsteen, in fact, from his Nebraska album. But that,
great album. I like that album.
But to me, that was just a academic responsibility to learn about symbolism and so forth. But I never really put pen to paper. I was the kid with the camera, actually. I took my dad's VHS video camera and started interviewing students in the hallways, and I turned my basement into a TV studio and started making my own video show. And this was in 1984 in Weston, Connecticut. So I went off to film school, went through 4 years of film school, and then I started working in the industry and found myself on a train going to a round-trip 3-hour commuting job in New York City. So that's how I became a poet, because screenplays weren't working when I was trying to write them in 3-hour blocks riding the train back and forth. I was writing one poem, another poem, and then a year later I looked in my screenwriting notebook and there were about 60 poems. So that's where I realized I was a poet and I should start perfect binding these words and start putting out my own books.
So you were in the subway, and you did that for quite a while.
Yeah.
And while you were riding in the subway, you started writing poems.
That's correct, but rather than a subway, it was a commuter train.
Commuter train.
So I was on, I would stand on the platform in freezing cold weather with holes in my boots, and I would feel the cold weather coming through my boots. I would feel it, and I would then get on the train, sit on the train for a good 80 minutes into Grand Central Station, and then do it again after my day job. So
How do you keep concentration? I haven't really ridden the subway or the commuter train.
the commuter train,
in New York, but I have in Chicago.
Sure.
Many times. And I know from my own personal experience, when I get there, even though you might seem chill, relaxed, you're still alert. And how were you able to separate the ambience in one of those trains and concentrate into poetry?
I love that question because as I went in to Manhattan, I had the Hudson River on one side. The whole entire 90-minute or 80-minute trip was with the Hudson River on one of my sides. So I would look out the window, and it became meditative as far as what I would see out that window. But if I looked to the other side, I saw my commuter people sitting next to me, and that's where I started writing everyman poems about what I thought their lives might be like. So my first manuscript is called Train of Thought, and it's all about what happens when an artist gets a day job and rides into work. All of the poems were written on the train, so it was the, thoughts of the Train of Thought commuter.
I often wonder from where the inspiration comes. Musicians, they say that their baby girl was born and right away they wrote a song or whatever. Your inspiration then came from those rides on the commuter train.
That's correct.
And what you saw around you, the people around you. And does that include the cold feeling of the snow through your boots and shivering?
Absolutely, yeah. And then, God forbid, I go to the dentist, You know what happens when a poet goes to the dentist?
He can't talk.
No, it's a whole inspirational thing of how I like pain, and I take in pain, and I received pain in kindergarten when people made fun of my last name. So bring it on, dentist. That's what happens when a poet goes to the dentist.
Wow. Does like in music, you remember Genesis, the group Genesis, right?
I do, but Peter Gabriel Genesis, not Phil Collins Genesis.
Right. I think it was Phil Collins when they did the album Abacab.
Sure.
Right. And that refers to some type of structure in music, right?
Yeah.
The A being the verse and the B being the chorus and the C the bridge and so on. Is there such structure in poetry?
There is, and I had alluded to at the beginning of my poetry journey, I was a frustrated screenwriter. So in film school, we learned how to write screenplays, and we were told that we're going to be taught the 30-30-30 method of Hollywood films so that if we wanted to rebel against it, we would know what we're rebelling against. So there is structure to poetry, and that's actually what turned me off. It's called Spoon Moon June, that whole, type of approach where every certain line has to rhyme. I can't tell my story. I can't tell your story. I can't tell a stranger's story in forced words. Now, if it fits and I can still tell the story, then I'm all into that. And I have several poems that have a rhyme feeling to them, but the other side is free verse. And I tend to be somewhere in the middle. I have contemporaries who write almost as though they're having a conversation. And that I feel is missing a little bit of craft. If I can get published by telling a powerful story that sounds like a conversation, I'm a little confused where the poetry is in that. So I will look at my writings and see where a rhyme is possible. And I feel rhyming helps carry the story along, and it certainly makes it easier to remember.
Interesting. So you found that that structure was actually restraining, it was not liberating.
Correct.
Like in music, you have certain structures, but you also have free form, and even that has a certain structure. But the idea of having to rhyme like every other line was limiting your creativity.
Absolutely.
Far out. So this has been now, what, 20-some years?
Yeah, it's been 30 years since the first time I was published, and a journalist recently asked me, if I remembered the first place that I got published, and I do, and that comes from, like I said, typing up the handwritten poems, looking through magazines for addresses of people who are looking for poetry, and so my first published credit was back in the early 90s in the Antisocial Misfit Terrible Poetry Press anthology. And it was about March Madness, but I was not a basketball fan, so when I heard March Madness, I was going to write about the madness that I was feeling because of March and spring coming. So that's my take on it.
When you publish a poem, does an editor have an input on that?
They do, and I have been an editor myself for some time, and it's a give and take. I've had editors that want to change the words around, and I sometimes take offense to that, but it is beneficial in some cases. For example, I had one of my poems translated into French, and the person said straight up that my poem about the garbage man that I was seeing and, relating to the garbage man, I referred to it as a smelly job. And that would be insulting to the garbage man who, has to put money on the table by doing that job. So I said, yes, you may remove that word. But in the first write, it was a smelly job because, garbage smells. And that was my take on it. But in the translation process in French, apparently you have to, be respectful to other people's jobs.
Perhaps if it was a poem about doing abdominal surgery, now we have a smelly job.
I guess so.
Tell me, you moved here how long ago?
It'll be 20 years this August.
No kidding.
Yeah, my kids were, in elementary school and middle school, and now they're grown up. One owns a home in Orlando, the other one owns a home in Gainesville, and my daughter, who just turned 29, she's my youngest. She just had a baby girl around Thanksgiving. So it's, my 19, close to 20 years here in Florida, my kids have been raised.
I see a poem in the making there.
Oh, a whole bunch of poems. Are you a grandfather?
I was, yeah. I had a granddaughter, yeah.
Oh, the feelings that I'm experiencing now as a first-time grandfather are something I never would have. I mean, just to hear my daughter say to my wife, Mom, I understand what it's like to be a mom now. I get it,
right.
And it was like an instant amends in that process, one day after the birth of her child.
So you came here, and what did you find in this town regarding poetry? What was the environment like?
It was on fire, a really exciting scene. There is a place on Spanish Street called Back Streets. And we even, my wife and I got copies of the newspaper sent up to us in Beacon, New York when we were getting ready for our move. We had relatives down here, and we, wanted to just be a part of the Saint Augustine place, and everything it had to offer. So they had in the newspaper, they had an entertainment section, and there was always talk about back streets, open mic poetry readings every Monday night. So there was so much excitement and so many poets in the downtown area that they were able to have it once a week, like an hour-long open mic. So it was a very thriving scene. So we moved in to that. And then I got caught up with like trying to redefine myself, like where would I find a full-time job where I could put food on the table. And it was kind of frustrating. Not that I was having trouble assimilating, being, you know, a New Yorker now in Saint Augustine. It was more like the safety net of a 10-year job being pulled out from underneath me. And I just ran to Flagler College because I was working in an art school. That's why I was riding the train for 10 years to get in and out of Manhattan at the art school where I was working. And I just thought, if I barged into Flagler College and said, I'm Chris Bodor, I have 10 years of experience at another university, could I please have a job? You know, I thought it was a easy sell, but they were looking for people with master's degrees, and I had a bachelor. I just couldn't pull that kind of accreditation out of my back pocket, so I fell into laboring, which was a kind of interesting second career. After all those years of commuting and working at a university, I was now, you know, laboring and having a very short commute, being a part of the town, being part of the culture, and not feeling like an outsider. Because, you know, when you go 3 hours round trip each day, you get kind of disjointed from your community. You know, I volunteered and I was a soccer coach, but above and beyond that, it was hard to really feel connected with the town I was living in.
What role are you playing now here in St. Augustine in the poetry community?
Well, there was that struggle that I talked about when I first moved here. I had a book that had come out. I thought I was hot stuff. Flagler College wasn't interested in me as a, you know, audiovisual professional. That was what I was doing in Manhattan. But the poetry, I had a book that I was showing around to people, and I attended the backstreet open mics. But the metaphor I use is there was a derailing. You know, I went from 10 years of daily commuting to being a local, finding a laboring job. And I got into some dark places. I was a social drinker, but then it got out of control. And so I bottomed out in my first 5 years down here, and then, you know, I found sobriety. So in that process of my family and I putting the family back together, and, you know, my kids were in high school, they needed a strong male role model, and I was ready to do that. And so my wife was like, why don't you start up an open mic like you did in Manhattan? And so we went and found a coffee shop and started it up, and that was in August of 2009. And it's been going every month ever since then. So, you know, I celebrate the years of sobriety, but they're almost identical to the years that we celebrate the open mic running successfully here in town. So I seem to be a conduit for poetry. People come to me and say, Chris, do you know like one or two poets who could help out and collaborate with this art project? I said, one or two. I could give you 10 if you'd like, or 20. And, you know, it's like, but if you just need two, I'll find, and that gets my gears turning, and I find the perfect poets for the project. Right poet, right project type of thing.
That's really interesting. So there are some poets whose topics are more suitable for other type of events. They have a kind of a style or of delivery, or is there a dark theme? Or
no, it's more than that. We talked about like the people behind the jobs. Well, there's people behind the poems too. Do we want to assign someone who can get a project done in 1 week? Or do we want someone who takes 3 months to get that brilliant poem out and just rewrite it and so forth? That's what I mean by
Wow.
right poet, right project. I mean, when some of like St. John's Cultural Council and some different art entities here in the area, sometimes it's like, we need this in 1 week, okay? So on a particular theme, so how can I make that materialize? Well, I have to pick someone who's shown and demonstrated that they are able to meet a deadline. You know, I would never assign someone who might have something just as brilliant but will be lost in the sauce and not be able to meet the deadline. When you open up a mic in town, I mean, I cut my teeth in New York City on the Lower East Side. When you have that, you know, form, it's free speech. It's no different than the soapbox in Hyde Park, or, you know, in England or London. You don't know what's going to happen at that mic, but there's going to be something brilliant in between the stuff. They say it's the wheat and the chaff, you know. It's like that separation project. All are welcome, all are equal, all have the right to share their 5 minutes of poetry. But through that process, they get better at the comfort level of being in front of the mic. And but the people who come to the mic who are, you know, seasoned, you know, they help bring the new people up with their performance level. These open mics across the country are becoming shows now with video technology and streaming and so forth. We, as a community, say it shouldn't be called a poetry reading anymore. These are poetry shows. And, you know, it's free entertainment and it's free speech. And some really amazing things come out of it.
So in music, as you well know, you have different genres. You have jazz, rock, blues, country. Any similar parallel to that in poetry?
You know, it's possible that I'm thinking that the diversity comes from the space. Like, I'm going to use Damien Rucci in New Jersey. He does an open mic in a cigar store. He does an open mic in a bar. He gets comedians and poets together, and this is like a series of 6 different open mics throughout the week. Some are in the evening, some are in the afternoon. That kind of attracts different people. We've always been Sunday at 3 on the last Sunday of every month. That's when we've been gathering for the last, 13 years. And what about all the people who like to watch football games on a Sunday afternoon? They're not at my open mic.
Right.
But if we had it on a Friday night, we would get a different crowd, a different type of poet, and a different type of poetry lover. So I say, if it's Sunday at 3, either someone's just finished up their homework for their college class, or they're working on something for a future manuscript. So let's celebrate the written word. So I've always steered people towards make this a celebration of the written word. If you have handwritten a poem on a cocktail napkin or a piece of loose leaf paper, bring it up, even if you're shaking, because that will help you bring more life to your poem, and also it'll help you to hear how those words flow off of your ears, how they come off your tongue and how they hit certain ears. It's all a helpful distillation process when you perform your poetry.
You've been published in other languages.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, me too. So, if I've been doing this for 30 years, then I get wind of people who are based in other countries. The internet has helped revolutionize that, and with Facebook instant messenger, sometimes I'm not aware of where people are when they're messaging me, but it seemed that like Saturday morning I would start getting text messages at like 5 a.m, but then it was from people, one person in particular in Poland. And so she was published in the United States. She had heard about me, and she was encouraging me to submit to her network. And with that she offered to translate my poetry that I wanted to send into the Polish language. But then, when you deal with foreign languages, it's hard to pronounce the names, and if I'm seeing it in writing on Facebook, I don't know how to pronounce those names. And during this interesting 6-month period about 6 years ago, I realized that there was a Polish woman who lived in Orlando who was interested in translating my work into poetry. There was a person who lived in England who also wanted to translate my stuff into Polish language. And then there was a dear woman who lived in Poland, worked in the Polish government, and she was translating my work into poetry. So I have 3 elderly female poetresses who are doing this, and the one in Orlando recently passed away, so that was unfortunate, but I'm very blessed. And they actually will share their translations with each other, because someone living in England will give it a more, a more literary spin. The person in Poland would give it a poetry of the streets feel, and then maybe the person in Orlando would give it a worldly translation. And I just get concerned when, I have this one poem that talks about Kerouac, and I'm talking about roadkill. So God forbid they would take the word road and the word kill and translate them, and then, it maybe put roadkill in parentheses if there isn't an applicable word in the Polish language, But
that's what I was curious about, because I read an article on American Journal of Physiology, where they were using poetry in order to bring the heart back to a given rhythm. So particularly after heart attack. So they had folks read poetry that was at a certain pace. They found that the breathing patterns and the speaking patterns somehow got the heart to beat at the proper rhythm.
Wow.
And but what was interesting about it was that they chose something from Homer that was translated into German. And they said that the translation kept the same rhythm as the original Greek. And so when you tell me that they're translating your poetry in Polish, I'm assuming this time, I wonder if they're taking that into consideration, that the translation of the words maintain the same rhythm that you wrote it with, without altering that pattern. What you know about that?
I think all bets are off, because I tried to get into that headspace. Once I started getting solicited, I said, rather than going through my back catalog of poems that I think they might want to translate, I started sending originals. Like, I started writing poems specifically with the idea that it would be easy to translate, because I didn't use difficult words like roadkill, what I was just talking about earlier, and then I just pretty much said, no, that's not how the translation process I don't know what the translation process is. I do know that if I take the text of my English poem and put it into Google Translate, it'll come out. But then I capture it and I send it back, and it's weird. It's like if I take my English stuff, translate it through the computer program into Polish, then take the Polish translation and put it back into England. It's weird stuff. So
right.
And then like with accents and omelette, if you leave those off, it has a totally different meaning. And you have to be very conscious of that when it's another language, and we don't really have anything equivalent in the English language.
Right.
Yeah.
So you write poetry in solitude, basically. You're by yourself.
Yeah.
But then you recite it to some type of audience. What did you have to do during the time in which you were writing poetry, but yet we were in lockdown? You were not able to be out there in public and sharing with other people.
So when I realized that I was a poet because I had written those 60 poems, and then I during lunch break, actually, I used a coworker's Macintosh computer. It was, back at that time in the early 90s, and I formatted the manuscript, and I found a self-publisher that would take everything that came off a laser printer and put a perfect bind on it. So sure enough, I had my own book of poetry. And my brother had a cyber cafe at the time on the Lower East Side. So like every other Thursday, I would bring the book down there and say, anyone else who wants to read some poetry? And that's how I started doing my first open mic. I have to tell you, the moment that opportunity was given to me by my brother, I would go back on my train ride and I would start writing poetry that would have an instant audience. I knew that every poem that I wrote during my writing routine would have an audio side if I chose to give it that. So that meant I couldn't use words that fall off my tongue strange and that I trip up on. So I had to, I'm famous for, there's a couple of words that I can't say correctly in the English language, even though it's my first language. And it's not an accent. It's not anything. It's just the way my brain is. And my family, they have pointed it out to me. So I don't put those words in my poetry. And so how am I going to know if these poems sound good while I'm writing them? I spoke about it's important that the train I was riding on, that you are aware that it wasn't a subway. It was these commuter trains that were not underground. So in between the two train cars is an area called the vestibule where you can go, but you're not supposed to really stop. You're supposed to go and get into the next car. I would actually sit there and I would recite my poems, and there was no one else around in that area. And the fact, there was signs that say, be careful when crossing through the vestibule. So that was the term that they used for this area. And I'm writing confessional poetry, and I'm speaking it out loud in the vestibule. I just fell in love with that. So I would sharpen my chops before I got on mic every other week by reciting my new stuff in the vestibule.
Far out. So you had an audience because you put this book together, you handed it over to people on the open mic, they read your stuff. During the pandemic, how did you manage?
Yeah, so you're telling me that I have to isolate and that I can't be around other people. Do you know how exciting that is for me as a writer? And I feel that other writers gravitated towards it too. It was in the spring of 2020, we were all talking about our 2020 vision. We're all getting pumped up, and then boom, the trolley cars stop moving in downtown St. Augustine. All is quiet. I was an essential worker, so I would go into work, and but you know, as far as the social life, I was volunteering at the amphitheater at the time. That was shut down, so I suddenly had a big hole in my schedule. So great, time to work on that manuscript, time to get in touch with a poet on the other side of the United States and talk about a tour or something like that one day when we're allowed to be in public. And then on the Zoom culture, we gravitated from a monthly open mic here in downtown St. Augustine to a Zoom open mic. And man, all you have to do is click a button, and suddenly the Zoom reading of 15 poets in the Brady Bunch, formation, looking at each other in the boxes. I do want to welcome Johnny McIntyre. Johnny, if you could unmute your mic. She is the Lucas County Poet Laureate in Ohio. And she's not the inaugural. Her government entity has been doing this, and I know there was an application process. So, first, Johnny, I wanted to welcome you to the Ancient City Poets open mic. How
Thank
you doing?
you.
Cool. Now, it suddenly went to Facebook, and that means people all over the United States could suddenly see what an Ancient City Poets reading was all about. And that was huge for us. We gained an international audience due to the pandemic. And we also started collaborating with other artists who felt that they were cooped up. I can't even begin to tell you the amount of collaboration projects I've done in the last 2 years. It's mind-boggling, and it's all because people are isolating with their equipment, with their paint brushes, with their writing software, and they're in isolation. So through text messages, instant messenger on Facebook, Zoom, we're able to create in isolation and be productive.
I have a clip I want to show you.
Sure.
It's of you, and I wonder if you will comment on that for a minute.
Guys, never give a microphone to a poet. Commissioner Horvath, Mayor, commissioners, and everyone out there, thank you so much for letting us celebrate poetry. National Poetry Month has been going on for more than 26 years, and for the last 13 years, we've been recognizing it through our Ancient City Poets group. We were actually created. Glenda Bailey Mershon and the St. John's Cultural Council said they wanted to do an open house, open mic in April of 2009. And I said I could do an open mic because I used to do it in New York City. And then the following August, I said, could I use that name to do something in town? We picked the last Sunday of every month, and that was 13 years ago. So there are people out there every month. We have 15 people on the sign-up sheet from all over, winterbirds, locals, travelers, and at least 15 to 20 people in the audience. So poets and poetry lovers, thank you so much for this.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
What was that about?
It was so exciting, to get a proclamation from the city of Saint Augustine. It's for National Poetry Month. It happens on every April. It's been going on for about 25 years now. So I started up a relationship with the St. John's Cultural Council when Christina Parrish Stone came on board as the executive director. And I think it was a socially distanced coffee we had downtown, and we were talking, and she said, Chris, what can the Cultural Council do to help the Ancient City Poets group? And I said, jump on board with National Poetry Month. I said, we celebrate it every year, whether we get help or not. But if you can help us beef it up a little bit, that would be fantastic. So it was April of 2021. She said that if we hijacked some events like a farmer's market, set up a table and give out some flyers, or a how to write poetry exercise, that just some interaction. And so there was a film screening series going on that was being held at the Butterfield, and actually they had it at the Art Box because it's larger. But I said, could I help curate it for April? And I got spoken word footage of well-known spoken word artists, and that's what was screened for that particular gathering. So that was one of the weekend events, and then we had our end of the month poetry reading that we celebrated, and we held that outside because of COVID, and it was fantastic to have a gathering right outside. National Poetry Month is our only real time to get the word out and share our love for poetry. So what better thing to do than have it outside? Tourists are walking by and it's right in their face. Whether they want to or not, they learn that people get together and read their poetry, and we got to share our love for poetry with the world. So that whole idea of a proclamation was Christina's idea. In 2021, we did it just for St. Johns County. So I got to go in front of the commissioners, and one of the commissioners at the time actually started off with one of his poems, and it was about how there is a proclamation that's sweeping the nation, and to introduce what. And then Christina came up and she spoke about the National Poetry Month initiative, and then I came up, and so I said, if we're going to make it bigger and better each year for 2022. Let's get the city involved too. And they said to me, you have to find a commissioner to speak on behalf of it. So that's where Commissioner Horvath, she was all in on that. And so that's what that footage was all about. That was where we beefed it up a little bit last year. And the end result is Commissioner Horvath then attended our Poetry Fest, where I had the Volusia County Poet Laureate give a little presentation about literary cities, that concept, and what a Poet Laureate could do for your community. And, he was speaking from experience. And so Commissioner Horvath spoke to the rest of the mayor and the commissioners, and lo and behold, there is now a Poet Laureate program, and we have a Poet Laureate for the city of Saint Augustine, and that all came about because I just wanted to give a spotlight to National Poetry Month and make it, not just 1 month where we, come out of our isolation.
That almost sounded like rap. There's a proclamation that's sweeping the nation.
Yeah. It's Spoon Moon June.
Right. You have some poetry for us.
I do.
Would you mind?
Yeah.
You have time.
Great. Yeah.
Make yourself comfortable.
I feel like a cicada. Brood 10 cicada descends on the eastern United States every 17 years. Swarm from the ground, a deafening sound. I've been underground for many years, suddenly alive for a month, living for the moment and making the most of my short life. Nymphs get their final cue. It's time to emerge, an uncontrollable urge. Fly to nearby trees, say farewell to miseries. Cicadas cannot emerge as adults until the weather is warm enough for mating. Many years of waiting. Emerging adults last for 4 weeks. During that time, they lay eggs and start the 7-year cycle again. My dead friends are like half-written poems. This poem is for my friend dying in the hospital bed. This poem is for my other friend who put a gun to his head. Words written for souls who know more than me because they have knowledge of what exists beyond the grave and the cemetery plot. I've lived through the winter of my heart, through the summer of my soul, and I know that my damage no longer defines me. A lifetime of poem ideas are scattered on my floor. I sweep the words into a dustpan, and then I place each word where they belong, carefully creating poems, short and long, because when I die, I don't want to leave behind half-written poems. That one I've never read live before, so thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I like to do things in pairs of 3. A pair would be 2, so groups of 3. Okay, so here is a poem that is newly written, and it's part of a 3-poem series, and I believe it stands alone. It's called Christmas Morning, Eating Fear for Breakfast. Lying in bed on Christmas morning, conducting inventory, when has fear been my guide, and when have I been guided by love? The complimentary breakfast at the hotel begins service at 6 with make-your-own misery waffles and humility smoked sausages smothered with regret, resentment, and remorse. Don't forget to get the plate of eggs not so over easy. Fear of the unknown, hard, cold stone, alone in a crowd, silence hurts my ears, stuck in a hole for days, months, and possibly years. I wait, and the wait is more than I can endure. I know the cure. Cast off the weight that is as heavy as a sewer grate. Usually I like to end with something cheerful, but I didn't bring anything cheerful. So, here's a cool one just to sign off. It's called Poetic Snapshots. I wrote it for the 450th that we had here in town. Artists and musicians on the performance stages, written history is leaping off the pages. What a great way to say happy 450, Saint Augustine. Happy birthday to the old historic town of Saint Augustine, a town as unique as an inverted obelisk. Neighbors and co-workers celebrating shoulder to shoulder with tourists as faraway travelers revel and reveal on the same grounds where tempers flared 50 years ago at the whites-only swimming pool of the Monsoon Motor Lodge. A melting pot fiesta, a living amends festival for the eyes, so much to see, a festival for the ears, so much to hear, a festival for the soul, so much joy for the heart to feel. The streets of St. Augustine have been flooding for 450 years, and most likely they will be flooding for another 450 years. A flood of art, a flood of love, a flood of peace. St. Augustine, Florida, do you realize how amazing you are? Thank you.
Thank you, brother. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
You know,
Wow, that was very good.
remember
really
in
enjoy
the,
that.
Thank you. Remember in the Daffy Duck cartoon where, you know, Daffy Duck does this amazing performance and then he ends up, you know, descending because he swallowed some gasoline and lit or something. He's like a little angel and they're like, bravo, bravo, do it again. Sorry.
Daffy Duck
Yeah. Yeah.
cartoon.
Yes, yes. Yes. I'll have to play it for you.
Wow, let me ask you, before, I know you got to run,
No.
two things. Like sometimes when I do an introduction or I'm doing some type of video, I use my teleprompter and I write the way that I talk. I punctuate, I give spaces between words because I know how I talk. I listen to myself, and so I write that way. Do you punctuate your poem accordingly, or is it just a long line of text?
No, my poems are in a poetry form. And in poetry form, you're supposed to take a little breath after each line. But then, after performing them again and again, they become like old friends. And they change a little bit. And there's also the possibility that I might trip up. And I then add extra stuff to cover it up. I am a work in progress. And when I originally wrote the poem that I performed for the first time here about the half-written poems, I originally called it unfinished poems. Because in my mind, you know, I want the poem to be finished and typed up and done, not little scattered bits of notebook paper. And then someone said to me that a poem is never finished. So I said, well, what I meant to say is unwritten or half-written. So we all agree that a poem is written when it's typed up and it's sent out to the publisher.
If some young person or whoever wanted to start doing poetry or reciting poetry, what advice would you give them? How to start?
So this happened actually yesterday. Someone found me on Facebook and they said that they had a poem that they wanted a real poet to look at and to give guidance. So I'm not an academic. I have never taught a class on, poetry writing. And I said, you're a poet already. You are a real poet because you wrote a poem. And I encouraged that individual to bring the poem to the open mic where it's a safe space, it's friendly, and we would bring it to the poetry community. And that is really my advice to everyone. The mic has been set up that way over the years where we've had like a 6-year-old once, and at the time the mic wasn't adjustable, so I gave them a chair to stand on so they would be up to the proper height of the microphone. And then all diversity, so many different voices are all welcomed at the mic, and it different levels of skill too. And we all are just, I sometimes call it like a open house, open mic. It's like, here we are, the poetry community is whoever shows up that month, and we're going to share, our poetry. But we also need people in the audience who are just there to listen. And, if we just had 15 poets on the sign-up sheet and 15 poets in the audience total, it would be just like on the Little Rascals when they did the play and they couldn't figure out why no one was in the audience. Then they turned around and realized that the whole neighborhood was on the stage in the play. You know, we need that at least 15 or so people who are just there to listen to what the poets have, and that gives them the distillation process, the whole way that, you know, the words flow off of their tongues, go over the microphone and into listeners' ears, and then it can be fine-tuned from there. It's part of the process.
Got it. I like poetry, jazz poetry.
Yes.
Where you have jazz music in the background while someone is reciting some poetry. Anything like that you have happening?
Yeah, big time. There's a project out right now that I got involved with called Recover. So it's R-E with 2 dots and then cover. And it's a interpretation of a spoken word track on the subject of recovery. And then Ryan Bosman, who records under the name Brotherwell, he adds some extra lyrics that he writes when he's inspired by the spoken words from the poet. He puts a musical bed underneath my track that he did featuring my poem. He said that not one instrument was real. It was all manufactured. So there's, you know, when you hear the guitar in the song, it's not him strumming on a guitar. It's just something he pulled up on the computer program, and but then he has some acoustic, organic stuff for other tracks also. So that, you know, that's like a studio project. But there's been times when I've read to bongos and they slow down and I slow down and I speed up and they speed up, and we did this whole thing. Like, since I was the train of thought commuter, he started banging out like a conga beat that sounded like train tracks, and I read over that, and it was just like the whole audience was transported into the train car with me as I was reading my old dusty train of thought commuter manuscript.
Awesome. Any final thoughts?
Well, please come out and celebrate poetry during National Poetry Month in April. At Flagler College, we're doing Saint Augustine Poet Fest. It's the 2nd annual. We have people coming from different corners of the United States, and they're getting hotels in Saint Augustine, and they're going to jump on the mic. All of Florida is going to have an opportunity. We have a 5-hour open mic marathon. We have symposiums on different disciplines or things pertaining to poetry. And we're also collaborating with the Duval Comic and Zine Festival. They're going to have zines like poetry books and so forth that you put together with 2 staples and folded paper. That's going to be all available as well, too. Poetry books for sale. And it's just going to be a poet fest. We're having a festival for poets and people who love poets. And, you know, it's something that we want to offer to the community, free and open to the public.
And your last question, who's your greatest influence in poetry?
Oh, you're going to leave me with that. You know, I have to say my mom.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's I found her notebook when I was a rebellious, you know, kid looking for the Christmas presents in the laundry room down in the basement in Connecticut, and I found the marbled notebook, the iconic marbled notebook, and there were poems in there that were, you know, some were sad and some were happy, and I was like, oh my goodness, my mom is a human being, you know, with feelings, and, you know, it's all there on the page. And so that was my reference point when I started. I could say that it was Charles Bukowski who got me into poetry, or, you know, but it was really that reference point was my mom.
That's beautiful, man. I thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a real pleasure and honor having you here.
Thank you.
Hope we do it again.
Cool, man.
Thank you, brother.
Take care.